Hello everyone, and welcome to the fifth session of the webinar of the Research Facility on Inequalities. I am Amanda David, IFD Lead Economist on Inequality and the Scientific Coordinator of the facility. This program, funded by the EU and implemented by IFD, comprises of more than 20 research projects, and we have launched this series of online conversation in order to present some of the results. Our first webinars touched upon topics such as perceptions of inequality in Mexico, earnings inequality in South Africa, inequality in urban access to urban water services in Bolivia, and the impact of inequality in public service provision on attitudes toward taxation in sub-Saharan Africa. We still have an interesting array of topics in the following weeks, and we invite you to join us every Monday at 5 p.m. Paris time and talk about inequalities, how to analyze them, and how to reduce them. Before we start, a few guidelines on the webinar. On the right of the screen, you will see you have a questions feature and a chat feature. You can type your questions in the question tab, and the panelists will respond them after their presentation. All the questions are public, and you can vote for those you think are more relevant. After the 30-minute presentation, I will select some of them and address them to our speaker. We have also opened the chat tab this time, and it will allow you to interact with the other participants. With this new situation and all the conferences moving online, I think we all miss the lively interactions that we have in conferences. One thing we might not miss are the eternal interventions with my question is more of a remark and not a question. So I invite you to put your remarks in the chat tab and keep the questions in the questions tab. Now, the webinar is recorded, and you know that a replay will be available soon. Today's webinar is dedicated to a program which has been led jointly with ICID, the Spanish Corporation, and Oxfam Intermón. And I welcome Ana Claver and Cristina Rovira, who will present an application of the Multidimensional Inequality Framework to the case of Western Africa. Welcome, Ana and Cristina, and you have 30 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Anda, for the presentation and for the opportunity to present the results of this research study on multidimensional inequalities in Western Africa. Thank you to all those listening to us at that time. And Cristina, will you help me please to pass the slides? Well, in this presentation, we are going to talk first about the study and its approach, including a brief explanation about the multidimensional inequality framework, which is the theoretical basis of this study. And then we will share some challenges and learnings that we have found during the research process. Right before my colleague Cristina will go into the key findings on inequalities in West Africa. And finally, we will present our policy recommendations for inequality reduction in the sub-region. So first of all, what is this research project about? As Anda said, well, this research project is an alliance between the AFD, the research facility, the Spanish Agency for Cooperation and Development, AFD, and Oxfam, to explore inequalities and effective public policies for inequality reduction. As you know, or as you may know, we, Oxfam, we are not academics or a center of studies. We are a civil society organization. We are practitioners, activist researchers, exploring and dealing with inequalities from a citizenship perspective. And that's something that we hope we can bring into this research study and into this space of the research facility. So what's the purpose of the study? We wanted to identify, measure, and analyze the most worrying expressions of inequalities in West Africa and in Central America, in two geographical different sub-regions, with a multidimensional lens, as well as identify some critical causes of those inequalities and suggest policy approaches and strategies to reduce them. Today, we are presenting the results of West Africa, a study conducted by Teresa Cabero, assisted by Arantxa Guereña, and we count with Teresa today here in this webinar too. She will join us in the Q&A session. And the study is focused, as you can see in the slide, in five selected countries of the sub-region: Ghana, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Burkina. Very briefly regarding the research methods, the study follows the multidimensional inequality framework that I will present in a second. And it is based on the analysis of secondary data on previous research, complemented and refined with consultations with a number of experts via questionnaire or key informant interviews. And also, we would like to point out the multi-actor and interdisciplinary workshop held in Accra in November of 2019. Why? Why to point out this workshop? Because with it, we try to contribute to bridge somehow that gap between research and practice and policy. In that space, many experts coming from the academia and center of studies, but also from civil society organizations, not only our colleagues of Oxfam, but also colleagues from women's rights organizations, the trade union movement in Ghana, or the Youth National Alliance, came into that space, along with representatives from international and regional institutions and bodies, such as ECOWAS, the Economic Commission for West Africa. And they came together not only to discuss the most worrying inequalities in West Africa, but to somehow to move into action or to discuss about change, what can be done, what policies may work for inequality reduction in West Africa today. So about the approach, I'm talking about the multidimensional inequality framework. As I said, this framework is the theoretical basis of the study. It is a collaboration. It was developed as a collaboration between the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion case at the London School of Economics and the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and Oxfam. We wanted to develop a tool to help us expand and deepen our understanding on inequalities, their drivers, and potential solutions in different contexts as means to a greater impact in our campaigns, in our knowledge, in our research. Also, we wanted to explore inequalities beyond economics and towards a multidimensional approach. We know that today, that nowadays, talking about multidimensional inequalities may sound familiar, but we feel it wasn't that popular 3 years ago. And therefore, this multidimensional inequality framework has three main pillars or dimensions, as I have just said. One dimension to measure and analyze inequalities, one dimension to analyze the drivers of those inequalities, and one dimension to take action, to explore potential public policies, but not only for inequality reduction, but not only. You can explore also other ways to fight against inequalities. So this framework, this multidimensional inequality framework, builds on the previous work done by the Center of Analysis for Social Exclusion to monitor human rights in the UK under the Quality and Human Rights Commission. I'm sure many of you have heard about the measurement framework for equality and human rights. And as well as this framework does, this multidimensional inequality framework also takes the human capabilities approach by Amartya Sen as its theoretical underpinning. As you know, the human capabilities approach is a well-known theory quite accepted and operationalized in the development field already, that allows us to explore inequalities in a more systematic way. What we tried to do with the support of the experts and academics of the LSE was to move this framework from poverty to inequality in terms of capabilities. That is, what the multidimensional inequality framework allows is to measure and analyze differences in human capabilities between groups of people. And so that's so how does what does this multidimensional inequality framework looks like? The framework tries to capture different inequalities across many areas, across 7 areas that matter for human life. If I asked what is important in life for you today, even this is a relevant question always, but even more in a time of pandemic. So what is important in life for you today? What would it be? What would you say? Maybe the first idea that comes to mind can be, well, the capability to be alive, to stay healthy and safe, and to enjoy a good and quality healthcare. Or maybe to be able to keep working more or less safely, but being able to get some income or even a dignified living wage to live a life which is meaningful for you, which makes sense to you. So this is what the multidimensional inequality framework tries to capture in these 7 domains or areas that matter for human life, as you can see in the small visual, in the circular visual, the picture in the slide, not very big in this one, but those colors that you can see are those 7 domains of life, such as life and health, or education and learning, personal and physical and legal security, or our capacity, our capability to participate in the political sphere, have an influence and voice. So regarding the structure of the framework, each of these domains has a number of subdomains, sort of like more specific issues that one can explore. And those domains and subdomains have a number of indicators and measures, trying to capture those differences in human capabilities between groups of people. These indicators and measures might be a bit impressive if you read more than 170 measures. They are comprehensive but not exhaustive, and this is a key characteristic, a key element of the multidimensional inequality framework. One should feel free to skip measures which are not relevant to her or his context and add other measures that might be or may be missing. So make the framework yours. And that's flexibility and the capacity to adjust to different contexts is one of the main features of this tool. And finally, regarding measurement of inequalities, I will only mention that the importance, the relevance, or variables of disaggregation, they are key because it is the comparison between different characteristics of people in a given context, whether it be the level of income, gender, or age, will allow us to look at vertical, horizontal, and spatial inequalities at the same time. And my colleague Christina will expand on it, on the things that we have discovered, we have found in the research in West Africa. Therefore, and as you can imagine, data availability is a challenge. Actually, talking about challenges and learnings, we have piloted and we have explored this approach to multidimensional inequalities in different geographical contexts and at different levels, at national levels, subnational, and at sub-regional levels, like in this case in West Africa. And we have some lessons learned so far. First, is that multidimensionality can be overwhelming. Although getting this multidimensional picture with different areas of life, different perspectives, is the most appreciated added value of the framework, it requires to find a constant and demanding balance between that broader scope to keep the multidimensionality and at the same time keep it feasible and being able to get enough or in-depth analysis of the object of a study. As just mentioned, significant data challenge because the multidimensional inequality framework is an indicator-based tool and that poses certain challenges, but as Cristina will explain, they can be transformed also into opportunities. And finally, we would like to make mention to a challenge that we have called breaking the silos. We don't want to add dimensions to inequality. We don't want to talk about multidimensional inequalities as just adding more dimensions to something, to inequality. But we want to understand and make sense of the interactions across inequalities, across all those domains of life, and truly understand how intersecting inequalities operate. As practitioners, this is a challenge not only in the research terrain, but also it is challenging to transform this complex analysis, for example, into a compelling narrative to make people aware of certain inequalities and what difference they make in their well-being, for example, or to transform that into an advocacy policy agenda. All in all, the challenge is how to communicate complexity, and precisely about that, my colleague Cristina will show now some of this complexity when presenting the results of the research in West Africa. Cristina?
Thank you, Anna. Will you help me with the slides? Great. So thank you, Anna, for such a compelling presentation. And in the next slides, I'll try to go through the main elements of the research in West Africa. First of all, I'll introduce the main domains analyzed, the main findings on who are actually the most affected collectives by inequalities in the region, and potential policy solutions. So starting with the field of the game and which were the selected domains for West Africa. Anna has introduced to you to a panoply of domains and indicators, which just shows to you to what extent this is a very flexible, adaptive tool to address inequality. And as part of the adaptation to the West African context, we selected the most important domains analysis based on the 3 criteria you can see in the screen that was already introduced by Anna. As a result of this process, the team decided that the analysis should mostly focus on 2 life domains, domain 1 on life and health, and domain 3 on education, which actually you can see highlighted because in fact was central to the analysis, as it is not only a domain where inequalities are clearly expressed, but also a driver of inequalities in other domains, such as dignified work or political participation. To a lesser extent, or with a medium intensity, you can see the second box. We also analyzed domain 4 on financial security and dignified work, and domain 5 on adequate living conditions. Actually, this domain was highlighted as well, was perceived by experts as the most relevant domain when addressing perceptions of people about their own lives, but also about inequality itself. And finally, unfortunately, we couldn't address in a systematic way the domains 2, 6, and 7, what we call the missing dimensions, mostly due to the lack of data or because they were considered less relevant by the experts, as it is the case of domain 7 on individual, family, and social life. And we recognize this may be key domains, especially 2 and 6, as there's growing research interest on concentration of power, analyzing political inequalities as a structural of many other inequalities, as well as on inequality dynamics and conflict, which relates very much to that second domain on personal security. And in fact, this was clearly highlighted in the workshop held in Accra. As Anna was saying, of course, we faced data challenges. The framework is an indicator-based approach, so data availability and quality become central challenges, in particular when we dealt with disaggregation, which is a key aspect that allows exploring what we call the compounding inequalities. This is the differences or gaps between different groups of peoples defined by income level, but also based on their location, gender, age, etc., which compounds several layers of inequality. For West Africa, for instance, we struggled to find disaggregation per ethnic groups, and actually we used instead the rural-urban divide as a proxy, or in certain domains to find disaggregation that went beyond gender. And of course, this could be leaving behind critical issues. So in the future, and we will see it in the recommendation section, we would recommend to find or promote other ways to measure and analyze inequalities beyond the quantitative field by building evidence through additional qualitative methods or fieldwork. So this is a bit the field of the game. So now I would like to show to you an attempt to map multidimensional inequalities and the main results of the analysis. We like to say, as Anna was mentioning, that the framework is a way to look at inequalities. It helps any researcher or practitioner to address in a systematic way the most relevant inequalities and gaps throughout different life domains. So in terms of key findings, what we can see is that the framework analysis helps us to unpack who are the most impacted collectives of inequality dynamics in a given context, for this case, West Africa, and the 5 countries that Anna mentioned before in particular. After analyzing the domains that I just mentioned, what we found is that income level, place of residence, gender, and educational level play a very important role in shaping opportunities and capabilities in all the life domains analyzed. So in general, what we can say is that it's women living in rural areas with a lower income and lower educational achievement, the ones who are the most disadvantaged, especially if we compare them to those people living in urban areas with high income and higher educational levels, and especially men. And as you can see in the picture, in the visual in the left, these inequalities have an accumulative effect. And this creates overlapping disadvantages, as if we were going through a onion, and compound disparities across any life domains. So they create this kind of spiral of inequalities you can see here in the visual. To address this in more detail, I would like to show to you who are the collectives so-called left behind in the region, according to our inequalities analysis, with some key statistic or key evidence that we found throughout the research. First of all, I wanted to speak about women and girls being one of the collectives left behind. As you can imagine, gender inequalities, as in most parts of the world, are structural, reinforce other disadvantages, and amplify existing gaps. And in fact, they often compound disadvantages related to socioeconomic status, location, or age. Let's see an example of an education. In Mali, we know that on average, almost 50% of children complete primary education school, while this proportion goes down to only 14% of girls from the poorest quintile in rural areas, in contrast with 85% of boys from the richest urban households. Furthermore, we know these gaps amplify as we move into higher educational stages. So it's mostly men from urban areas, from the richest 20%, who reach this educational level in countries such as Burkina, Mali, and Niger. So we see how location, income level, gender compound inequalities in this domain. Gender inequalities are also very pronounced, for instance, in the dignified work domain. In West Africa, women are a majority in the informal sector in all countries studied. For instance, in Mali or Niger, almost 95% of working women work in the informal sector, compared as well with also very high but lower male rates. And they also make up most of the domestic and care work force, almost entirely unpaid. So even if there is very little data on this, on average, we found that women spend 6 times more time than men on unpaid care work. And of course, this gap amplifies again in the rural areas. So we can see 2 very specific life domains where gender inequalities, but also income and also rural-urban inequalities compound as specific consequences of inequality for women and girls. The second collective I would like to highlight today is people living in rural contexts. Spatial inequalities between urban and rural areas are connected with unequal access to public services, especially in the fields of education, health, and infrastructure. And we can observe how this translates in pronounced gaps in educational or health results. For instance, if we look at achievements in literacy rates in maths and reading skills, we found that these are very different depending on the place of residence. Ghana is perhaps the most equal country we analyzed, with a percentage of literacy rate of children on average varying from 80% in rural areas to 93% in urban areas, which is still quite an impressive gap. But if we take a look to other countries, such as Niger, we see that it has a very big gap with a literacy rate of 67% in urban areas, but only 15% in rural areas. And the difference between urban and rural areas is greater than 3 times in Burkina and almost double in Senegal. So again, we see how rural-urban inequalities manifest in a very dramatic way. So it's very important to keep in mind this rural-urban divide when addressing the main expressions of inequality. The third collective I wanted to introduce to you today is young people, and especially young women, as age inequalities are particularly relevant in the domain of dignified work, but also to understand inequalities in voice and influencing. For instance, to understand the conditions of young people, we looked at the percentage of youngsters between 16 to 18 years old, not in education, employment, or training. Again, we found women were systematically more impacted by unemployment or lack of training. And we also found big inequalities between urban and rural areas and by income level in all countries except in Ghana, maybe. In rural areas of Niger, 80% of young people are not in education, nor in employment or training. And this percentage was a bit lower, but still quite impressive in Burkina and Mali, where it was 65%, and also in Senegal, which was 50%. We also looked at the percentage of young people who have formally contacted local, national government, or a party representative in the last 12 months. And on average, in the 5 countries, we found that, in general, more than 80% of the population never formally contacted any representatives at all. And of those who had contact, there were more than double of men than women in all countries, and they also tended to be older, over 36 years old in Burkina, Ghana, and Mali. And interestingly, in Niger and Senegal, they tend to be a bit younger, between 18 and 25 years old, the groups that were more active in making those contacts at several levels. I also wanted to highlight a 4th group, which is the lowest income households. Individual and household income is a clear axis of inequality, and it overlaps with other variables we saw already, such as location and gender. This is to say, individuals at the bottom of income distribution are also the most exposed to multidimensional inequalities, in contrast with those at the top. So I will not go any further, as it's maybe the axis of inequality most explored by literature, and we saw already some examples of these compounding inequalities, but maybe we can go back to it later in the Q&A. And last but not least, I just wanted to mention a couple of groups to be further explored, mostly due to data issues. Ethnic group and religion, despite very weak data, were as well considered by the experts and participants from the workshops as very relevant variables to understand inequalities. But again, using these variables is problematic as data is very weak and can be also very sensitive in the political context of West Africa. And also people living with disabilities. Unfortunately, due to the scope of the research and lack of suitable data, we couldn't explore in more detail inequalities experienced by this group. However, we know this is relevant and could be further explored. In fact, in Burkina Faso, we know, according to research done by the World Bank, that having a disability increases the probability of a child never attending school by about 2 times. So we know this is an issue worth exploring in future research attempts. So to wrap up, what we can see is that the multidimensional inequality framework analysis helps us to unpack who are the most impacted collectives of inequality dynamics in a given context. This in turn helps to identify and practice whose demands and needs should be addressed, whose voices should be amplified by the specific public policies processes. And this connects very much with this slide that helps us to just turn into policies. As our research in West Africa identified 3 structural drivers and 4 policy drivers, as you can see in this visual, that can explain the impact dimension inequalities. I'm not going to enter into the structural ones. Maybe in the Q&A conversation we have time to conversate about it, but the ones identified at the policy level. So these are the ones you can see in the inner circle, which connects very much with our suggested recommendations. In the context of West Africa, the 4 policy drivers we identified, as you can see in the visual, are inadequate investment in essential services, mostly related to education, health, and social protection. Also, inadequate investment in smallholder agriculture. The third driver, a highly dualistic labor market structure with limited formal employment opportunities and large informality, particularly for women and young people. And the 4th policy driver, which connects with the role of regressive taxation that limits, on the one hand, the capacity to mobilize predictable, sustainable funds for the policies I mentioned before, but also that not play the equalizing effect that would be expected by progressive taxation. This is collecting more from the ones who have more. In the case of West Africa, in front of these suggested 4 drivers that I mentioned, the policy responses or solutions that we came up with revolve around setting a specific approach, a specific vision on this package of policies. So a set of policies targeted towards the most remote rural areas to correct for spatial inequalities, which we saw are quite acute, and directed towards women, youth, and other minorities and marginalized groups. This is ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, and so on. And also, and very importantly, including elements of citizenship participation, transparency, and accountability in the design of policies and implementation. So national governments, but also international development actors and regional institutions, then could promote responses to tackle inequality around these 4 policy areas that I mentioned, that you can see reflecting in these 4 pillars. This is essential services, agricultural policies, labor policies, and progressive fiscal policies, with this specific focus, this specific approach I just mentioned. So just to start wrapping up, we move into the final recommendations. And we think that regional institutions such as ECOWAS, YMU, the SEALs, or the African Union could make the most of the existing spaces, structures, and processes to mainstream this specific approach to inequality reduction at several levels. First, as you can see in the top of this graph, by maintaining a clear commitment to tackle multidimensional inequalities, as well as evaluating the impact on inequality reduction of their current policies policies and programs, but also by reinforcing the member states' capacities to tackle multidimensional inequalities. And this could be done by strengthening their capacity to coordinate policies across different sectors and multiple levels, and by keeping policy coherence as the overarching guiding principle when speaking about reducing inequalities. As you can see here, we also suggest the four policy packages that I just mentioned. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but maybe I'd like to unpack a bit more the second and the third pillars, as these were part of the main discussions we had with civil society and experts in the workshop held in Accra. We may go through the others in the Q&A section, but just for the sake of time, on agricultural policies, what we suggested is that regional institutions set policies targeted to the most remote rural areas, the needs of food crop farmers, small-scale agriculture producers, pastoralist populations, women, and the youth. And among the main measures within the package, maybe just to highlight that the regional institutions could accompany member states to uphold Malabo Declaration and the CADECT by increasing investment in agriculture to a minimum 10% of national budgets. Regional institutions also could invest in a new deal for rural West Africa, keeping in mind these collectives that I just mentioned. Promote the full implementation of the African Union framework and guidelines on land policy in Africa, and specifically with a particular focus on women's access to land, and also to build on the existing ECOWAP to ensure targeting policies and interventions to address explicitly inequality reduction. Related to the labor rights and dignified work, we found again that there's still room for improvement. First, to adopt a regional structural transformation strategy to reduce drastically the informality and youth underemployment that characterizes today the labor market in the West African countries. Also, to design and implement a regional plan to protect labor rights and ensure dignified work, and fight against discrimination against women with affirmative action labor policies, and also to review minimum wage policies and regulatory regimes to lift the wages of the bottom 40% of wage earners and progressively move towards the adoption of a common framework of minimum living wages. And finally, as you can see in the bottom of the graph, we would call for regional institutions to support key local actors, counting, measuring, making sense of inequality. As you can see, the recent analysis of UNECA just identified that less than 38% of SDG indicators in West Africa have data for African countries. So there's room to support national statistics systems to gather more frequently, more and better data related to inequality. And again, this aggregation is crucial to map these compounding inequalities we just saw. Also, to promote qualitative research and studies, which can complement the existing databases for us to acquire a better understanding and making sense of inequalities. And lastly, to support initiatives to build data and make sense of inequalities in the less known domains. Do you remember? So participation, influence and voice, concentration of power and political capture, inequality in context of conflict and security degradation, or inequalities within cities. So this is these were the main research findings in a nutshell. It's been a great challenge to summarize it in such a short amount of time. So we'd be very happy to conversate with you over the Q&A. And I leave the floor back to Anda to moderate the second half of the session. Thanks.
Thank you so much to both of you. So we'll be inviting also Teresa Gavero, who is the main researcher for Western Africa, and Carlos Botea to join us and chat about these research results. But maybe we could start by having this discussion on the data used for this analysis, and also, for instance, the experts that you have contacted, who they were and how they were selected. Hello, Teresa, welcome as well. And I don't know which one of you would like to start.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to first say thank you to AFD for organizing the webinar and all the participants for the interest. And congratulations to Anna and Christina for a fantastic presentation, not easy at all to summarize all the work and the findings and the challenges. And I think, I mean, from my side, just to probably reiterate a bit what has been said already, one is the challenge, but also the beauty of the tool that Oxfam has developed for analyzing inequalities. It is indeed overwhelming, as Anna said very rightly at the beginning, but it's true that I'm convinced that it really helps to look at inequalities from a different perspective. So beyond the analysis per se and the research per se, I think it's a very useful tool to provoke and articulate the dialogue and the thinking and the reflection about inequalities in any context. So in that sense, I think it's worth to acknowledge the value of the tool and the methodology and the effort that comes with it. Having said this, the second part of the challenge with this type of analysis and with, I would say, with any type of serious analysis in research is the data. So that last call that Christina said at the end, which is a call to support the capacity to generate and develop and update the data in countries is a real urgent need. Without the data, and it happens everywhere, it's not only in West Africa, it's not only in Central America, it happens in Europe, in Spain where I'm based, everywhere. In the absence of data, we don't know what is happening. So policymakers will make decisions in blindness because they don't know what is the situation and they won't see what will be the impact of what they decide. Civil society has a very difficult task to follow and analyze and know and address what is happening, etc., etc. So data, both quantitative but also qualitative, as Christina said at the end, is really, really key if we really want to push an agenda and a way of doing things in development, which is based on evidence and informed evidence, which is just an exercise of learning and trying to do things better. So that's very, very, very key. And then in terms of the analysis per se for the West Africa sub-region, the 5 countries that we analyze, again, considering and despite the difficulties of the availability of data, I think the findings are really interesting in the sense of, well, Christina explained it very well, but the way that the different variables that we could use, such as gender, age, so focusing on youth versus other age groups, but also those variables that were not available, and then making this difference between rural, urban, and the overlap among all of these. I think it provides a different a different way to think about development strategies in countries. And that's something that I learned and I've been repeating again and again in this and other exercises on inequality, and is the difference between tackling poverty, as development has been doing for many years, and the difference with tackling inequality. For tackling inequality, we need to do more than just trying to reduce poverty. We need to understand which are the dynamics in the context and how, when we apply certain policies, somebody will benefit, but then somebody will also be hurt or harmed or less better off or less benefited than with another policy. So understanding these dynamics is very important to reduce inequality, because we are trying to close a gap where many people are sitting in many different conditions. That's something that is very important. And also, one of the main findings of this research, because we use, probably because as a result of focusing in this rural-urban divide, but also we manage, in some countries, we managed to see some data by specific districts or regions in country. And what we see is that systematically, the most disadvantaged groups are those sitting in the very remote areas. And bringing policies to those very remote areas is costly, is expensive in terms of money, is expensive in terms of time and resources, human resources. So I assume that there is a big temptation not to do it, and then instead focusing in areas which are easier to target, to reach, and where we will probably also have a very strong impact, because there is people also living there in poverty with very strong needs. So it's not to say that they don't need that support, but that will be poverty alleviation. But if we don't make that effort to really identify and try to reach out to those communities that are really far away from the system, often very far away from this infrastructure that we need to reach these communities, we won't be really tackling inequality. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, on inequalities, as also was mentioned, we have the issues with the top of the income and wealth distribution, and that comes together with power. So income and wealth in the higher levels is very closely attached with the capacity to exert your power, to influence policies, to influence decisions in societies, etc. So that's also a need to be understood. Is often very delicate, because well, power normally wants to remain in the powerful positions, and it's difficult for people to acknowledge that they are in a privileged situation. So that's also a tricky, I think, call for all of us working in development, to learn how to talk about things without judging or without putting guilt on the situation that is as it is, but then we can move from there and try to do things differently. So I leave it here. I'm available for questions if there are any. Thanks.
And I don't know if you want me to compliment a little bit about the question on data sources and keys. And Teresa, I'm sure you can help with this. Just very briefly to mention at the beginning, Anda, you were asking for what kind of data sources we used, and what kind of experts, and how we came into that selection of experts. Teresa, I don't know if you could listen to that question. So about the data sources, I don't have exactly the latest data that we use. Maybe Teresa remember some of the data, but I can check it quickly. We use mainly global data sources, sorry. Of course, the SDG indicators database or the global human development indicators, all, well, databases from the World Development Indicators database, on health, the Global Health Observatory, global databases on violence against women and girls, UNICEF global database on education. And Teresa, I don't know if you want to add maybe later something more, some maybe super relevant to you or that were key. We used other, well, we used at some point some national data sources when we wanted to look at something specifically, or just to make sure that we that the data gap was real, that there wasn't a national I don't know, fabulous survey that could fill that gap that we couldn't find. And we also used other regional sources, maybe weaker than the ones that we have just cited, like, for example, the Afrobarometer, to analyze some of the inequalities in the participation, influence, and voice domain, because it's the only data that exists. But we know it's a weak survey because, as Teresa many times said, there are, for example, some questions with only 14, 15 respondents. So obviously we have to take this into consideration. And about the years of the data, I mean, like how the last, I don't know, Teresa, if you can complement on that. I mean, I know that for some countries there were well, very, how to say, not updated data. Maybe you can say something about this, Teresa.
Yes, and I'm sorry because I indeed missed the question. It was probably when I was coming into into life. So yes, in general, the process was to focus on the date. I mean, the one thing that we had to take into account is that it was a regional study. So we wanted to find data or find indicators and trends that we could not, I mean, that we could use in the 5 countries that we were studying. So for that, you need to have the data on the same source or the same process of verification and construction of the indicators. So that requires to put us in either a regional or an international global level of analysis. So for that, the best and the main data source was the SDGs indicators. Also to mention that there is a great effort happening in UN and with all the countries in the UN to really build that database of indicators. So my suggestion is to try to complement that effort, which is still ongoing, and it has the advantage of once you go to the database, you know whether an indicator has been constructed and has the data, then you know that that data has been cleared and analyzed and you can use it. If the indicator is under construction, then you are not sure. And if you go into the country data sources, the difficulty is that normally you have to go to the very basic raw materials, which requires a lot of time of cracking the data. But then also once you have the data, you're not sure if you can compare it with the data on that indicator from another country. So with that in mind, we decided to focus on the global data. So SDGs was a great source. Also the health, the stat compiler of USAID, with the DHA's program of is basically data on health, but it has also for some countries data on water and sanitation and electricity availability and something on violence also. So that's also a very compelling database to be used in this exercise. And then we had some ad hoc, like for example, the rule of law index for issues related to legal security. But again, the more local you want to go and the poorer the country is, the more difficult is the data. So in particular, answering your question, data, for example, for Mali and Niger was really difficult to find for many, many indicators. And the second difficulty is that in order to assess inequality, the data has to be broken down by some type of variable. So it's not enough to know how many people went voting in the elections if you cannot compare to which groups these people belong, either by their place of residence or their age or their belonging to certain identity groups, etc. You cannot use it for inequality analysis. So altogether made a reduction of the data. And then answering to the other question in terms of the experts that we consulted, we reached them through the networks of Oxfam and with the help of the French Development Agency as well. And they help us also to really focus on the important issues in the region. And then it was nice that there was a general agreement and yeah, a very common assessment of where were the issues of relevance for the region. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Teresa. No, Christina, if you would like to add a few things, maybe reflect on the fact that the experts came from very different domains.
Yeah, just to complement very quickly what Teresa said, some of the consulted parties that came to and were invited to the workshop in Accra actually build on the work that Oxfam is doing in the region. And we had colleagues, for instance, from Women in Law and Development in Africa, WILDAF, or also WANEP, which is a regional network of peace building in West Africa, very active, or as Anna was saying, colleagues also working on the Trade Union Confederation in Ghana. And as just Teresa was mentioning, we also built and sought to connect with other colleagues active in the research facilities, such as Institut Supérieur de Sciences de la Population in Burkina, or also colleagues from ACEIR who have been also developing a very interesting tool, very similar, no? With some connections to the multidimensional inequality framework, which were also part of the consulted parties in these in-depth interviews that Anna was just saying at the beginning of the presentation. So we tried to, merge different civil society, but also academia profiles in our triangulation process.
Thank you so much. And we still have a very few minutes to go, but maybe if we could hear your thoughts on Eva's question on targeting policies and which would be examples of successful and unsuccessful approaches, especially maybe linked to the work that you guys have done on policies and the structural drivers of inequality. And I would just like to add, because there's a question on the access to the data sets, and this report will be released quite soon, I hope. And given that most of the data is global data, it's publicly available, then you looking at the report, you will be able to see where the data is and access it. And also, if Anna or Teresa would also like to answer to some of the other questions, feel free. You can do so in writing. So who would like to start on the question on targeting policy to the vulnerable population?
Teresa, do you want maybe to go for a try with the targeting policies? Or Chris, explain maybe a little bit about the context and our work in West Africa? Or...
Okay, just very quickly, I can give an example that was very illustrative. That was from the time of the Millennium Development Goals. One of the successes that has been reported very often has been in Ghana, in the effort that Ghana made against fighting against poverty, which again is a very much needed intervention, and it was a very much needed intervention. But then when you analyze when some of the policies or many of the policies for alleviating poverty, took place, they concentrated mainly around the belts of Accra and the main cities, which again makes sense because these areas accumulate a lot of people moving into urban areas. So in a situation of disadvantage, clear disadvantage, so they were in need, and the policies were very efficient in terms of ameliorating that situation of poverty. However, if you were comparing and doing that inequality analysis, and you compare what is the situation pre and post the intervention, comparing with the poorest people in the most remote areas, by lifting up some people in urban areas, you're actually widening the gap compared to the very remote people in rural areas. So that's an example of how by doing a very good and effective intervention on poverty alleviation, if you don't have this inequality lens, you may be unintentionally be contributing to widening the gap. So it's not to say that that's incorrect. It's just to say that it depends how you want to focus your intervention. Be aware of these dynamics and these differences. On the other hand, there are experiences of, as Christina said, of positive action, for example, in terms of gender participation, access to job markets, etc., where you can promote specifically the incorporation of people, either women or people belonging to certain minority groups, into that access to school or access to jobs, etc., which will help immediately to reduce that gap in that specific area.
Thank you so much. I know if Anna or Krishna, you would like to add a last remark, because we're running out of time.
It's very difficult just to finish, because it feels like it's a very interesting conversation what we are having now. But yeah, building on what Teresa said, well, our research in terms of scope, we couldn't analyze or look in more depth on inequality in context of on conflict and instability. But from the work and the analysis we've been doing in Burkina, for instance, we know that the lack of investment in certain regions of the country partially explain the kind of frustration and ground for current instability in the country, no? Specifically the lack of investment in Boucle du Monde, the Sahel or the northern regions, partially explain this feeling of frustration, lack of legitimacy of the state, and how this could be read as one of the multiple causes, of course, that partially explain the degradation of the security situation in Burkina, no? So this is why we were suggesting that as part of this targeting, also including this rural-urban divide or regional divide when we are looking on investment and effective and quality investment is a crucial factor when rethinking this set of policies. And as Teresa was saying, as part of our efforts on fiscal justice, Oxfam has been working for years on fostering processes of gender-responsive budgeting and how, by including the needs and demands of women and girls across the fiscal cycle, we can, with the years, reduce the observed gap in several domains of life. And this is a very specific intervention, which includes, of course, the participation of women, girls, but also women's rights organization across the different different stages of the life cycle of budgets throughout years. So these are two very specific issues, but I invite you to look at our websites and our reports, which very much connects with these two kind of examples or realities.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry because there are still unanswered questions, and I also had some of them on my list, but we are really running out of time and we have to stop here. Again, a huge thank you to all of our participants, and also especially to Anna and Cristina and Teresa, and Carlos couldn't join us finally. Next week, we'll be talking about the dynamics of micro-level consumption in Ghana with Nkechi Iwo from the University of Ghana and the African Center of Excellence on Inequality Research. And we hope to see you then next week at 5 p.m. Thank you, everyone.